floor is yours.
Excellent. Sorry, my eyesight's not what it once was. Welcome, councillors, to the latest in the briefings on the recommendations of the Independence Hearing Panel on Tranche 2. Today we're going to be covering a number of infrastructure and designation matters. Up front, I wanted to have just a quick talk about how designations work in district plans. They are a planning instrument that is quite different in nature to the rules and listings and the other controls that you have already made decisions on in the first tranche. So, a way of thinking, what I thought we'd do is just show you some practical examples. I like to spread the love around the city, so today I thought we might focus on Broadmeadows. So, in the first tranche of decision making, you made a lot of decisions about things like zonings. Zoning's a form of index, basically. It is how we spatially distribute rules across the city. And that forms a fabric, and from that fabric you punch out resource consents for activities that don't fit within those rules. Designations is another way of moving through those rules, and what that is done by requiring authorities. Requiring authorities are generally ministers of the Crown or large infrastructure providers. So, for example, NZME with its transmission, the Minister of Education with their schools, or Waka Kotahi with the motorway there. And what these are is the use of this authority to move things that could not be consented easily through those zones, and also to provide a standard process across the country. So, for example, the open space zone doesn't really anticipate television and radio transmission. So that is why there's a designation that allows for the establishment of that mast on top of Coco. Just like the Minister of Education needs some degree of consistency across the country when designing and planning schools. So those are generally done under designation. The important thing to recognise is these are essentially paths through the zoning rules. So what you do as a planner is you look through the notice of requirement, you understand the purpose for which it has been required. So, for example, this is Rāroa Intermediate. The purpose is a school. For those aspects of the application that are building a school, they fit under the notice of requirement and they pass through the zone rules, essentially, and so they can be built as of right. When you are dealing with things that are not covered by the notice of requirement, so they're for a different purpose, or the land is being disposed of, or it's being leased out for another reason, then those will be dealt with under the zone rules and the general rules of the district plan. The other thing designations do is they interact with the property rights system. And so in this case, this is the tunnel that goes from Glenside down to Nauronga, and you can see its path marked there on the district plan maps. And what that designation is doing is alerting planners and landowners that there is a tunnel underneath there, and gives KiwiRail the right of referral through consents. And so what that means is that if you are looking to build something on top of that tunnel, KiwiRail would have a right to make sure that that's not going to interfere with their ability to either maintain or build the tunnel. For most people in Newlands, it's not really all that relevant given the tunnel is so far down, but when you start to get close to portals, it becomes important. It's also a very important power for line infrastructure companies when it comes to utility planning. So this is how we preserve corridors under the RMA. So, for example, for transmission lines done this way. The important pieces of the RMA when we deal with this are those requiring authorities. So they are laid out in the RMA. The requiring authorities give powers to ministers and those large infrastructure providers to undertake these works and to protect pathways and protect their operations. Where it matters for you as councillors is that under a district plan review process, requiring authorities are required to requiring authorities are required to notify us of changes to the designations, and then they are included in the PDP. So these are not instruments that you are making direct decisions over the way you do over things like zoning rules. What you're doing is receiving the decisions of these authorities and compiling them. They go into the district plan so that the consenting system can work. You do, however, have the power to make a recommendation to the authority. And what that does is basically raises concerns or operational issues that may result from the content of the notice of requirement. Your recommendation then goes to the requiring authority, and they can either accept the council recommendation or they can amend the recommendation with reasons for doing so. And then if those recommendations are not taken on board, you can then move to appeal through the courts.
Requiring authority?
So a requiring authority is we'll do questions at the end, but to be fair, this one is fairly fundamental. So a requiring authority is a Minister of the Crown, like the Minister of Education, or it is a large infrastructure provider. So, for example, the airport is a requiring authority, so Airways New Zealand. But today what we will do is we will run through these topics, and we will have questions at the end. The reason for doing questions at the end is there's a fair amount of stuff in here, and it's important that we make sure that council is informed on it as quickly as possible, basically. So we'll move to the infrastructure chapter, and Andrew will take you through this.
Good afternoon, councillors. So yes, my name is Andrew Wharton. I'm a team leader at the district planning team. Oh, already on there. So the infrastructure chapter is looking at infrastructure overall in the city and does include transport infrastructure and things on the road and rail. It doesn't, however, include the community infrastructure like the schools and hospitals. And the ports and airports have their own chapter on this. We do have sub-chapters as well where you've got specific overlays. So in the coast environment, ecosystems, indigenous biodiversity, natural hazards. So this is recognising we need special rules for infrastructure in those special areas. And the panel is also recommending a new sub-chapter for the national grid and electricity, which I'll talk about. So we had quite a few submission points on this, 820 and 295 further ones. The key matters that the panel considered were matters to do with the national grid and making sure it's aligning with national directions on it and national standards. Also how the sub-chapters interact both with the zones but also with the main infrastructure chapter, and also how it interrelates with the port and airport and renewable electricity generation. There was concern that the directions don't overlap or contradict, but that they kind of fit together nicely. And they also considered that balance between providing for infrastructure but also for private property rights and notification. The recommendations I'll take you through are perhaps a bit more specific than that high-level matters. The first one being some text to increase the amount of protection in the policy for infrastructure from incompatible subdivision use and development from complaints. So that's another word for that is reverse sensitivity. They thought that it should be more balanced towards the infrastructure. The bus shelters and electric vehicle charging stations have clearer rules, I think it's fair to say. So previously they were kind of buried under other rules. These were brought out and given specific standards to say that these are definitely enabled within the city. And some more specific things about tree standards when building new roads and giving more discretion to the council about what trees are appropriate in what areas, rather than having a whole list of different trees you have to pick from. The panel recommended rules to limit bird strike to plane flights. So this limits the the activities of marine food processing, storage waste areas that birds can access, abattoirs, landfills, composting, things that are attracting the birds, and that these things can happen, but through resource consent, they'd have to have some control around birds, and so that they don't affect the planes flying in. And then the other thing, which is airport related, and my colleague Jamie talked to you about this before, from more of a coastal environment point of view, and that's the airport mole point seawall. So there was some question at the time whether this was part of the airport and therefore infrastructure, or whether it was separate and not, and had to be dealt with under the coastal environment. And during the hearing, the regional policy statement came out and said, yes, it is a regionally significant infrastructure as part of the airport. So the panel said, okay, let's make sure we have permissive infrastructural rules and policy for it. The national grid, the panel found it better to place all of the provisions both for building national grid structures and also for activities that are near the national grid to be in a separate chapter, a separate subchapter, and clarifying that those activities must not compromise the national grid. So it's quite difficult if you're wanting to build your house near one of those structures to make sure that it's not interfering with access or with maintenance of it. Also, that if there is a resource consent required and it's within the buffer that the Tranche has, that they're considered an affected party and can submit on these consents. There was also some debate about the actual location of some of the structures. The setbacks vary quite a lot based on the what type of line it is and what type of structure it is. So they said, let's just have a corridor, and within that corridor, Transpar will advise whether this is a pylon, tower, or an Q brace or whatever, and we'll tell you what the exact setback should be based on the definition in the plan. And then under another subchapter called Other Overlays, which are for those matters, the panel generally made recommendations to make things a bit easier for smaller infrastructure works, such as allowing infrastructure where it's not directly affecting a piped hour, if the ground's previously disturbed, to permit activity within that, if it's small, if it's away from notable trees, archaeological sites, and if it's just a customer connection, that they wouldn't need to get separate resource consents for that. Should I move on to transport or question? Okay. So transport is different in that, unlike the infrastructure chapter, it focuses on the transport activities actually on site and getting access to the site. So the things like roads is actually dealt with in the infrastructure chapter instead, and rail. It uses the council's transport hierarchy, so it does include standards for walking and cycling as well as for vehicles, and we had 307 submission points on this chapter. So again, the recommendations are relatively specific. For example, making sure that there's access to buildings if the buildings are a set distance away from the road and need fire truck access. A few changes in terms of the integrated transport assessment threshold. So this is if you have a significant activity that's generating traffic, when council can assess what effect and what impact it has on the transport network broadly, which can be a bit of work to create that assessment. So they increase the threshold of transport trips generated from 200 to 500, except if the new activity is accessing a state highway, in which case it dropped from 200 to 100. Previously, all changes to drive-thrus and service stations had to get an integrated transport assessment. They said, no, let's just, they're recommending that the same standards apply, the 500 car trips. When calculating those car trips, that you can have perhaps fewer if the household is smaller, because you should have fewer car trips, and also exempting Wellington Airport itself from these integrated transport assessments, given it's kind of managing its own transport within its area. So that doesn't include land that the airport owns, such as the bulk retail mall, but it does include things like if they were adding an extension or adding some more shops inside their building, that they shouldn't have to do an integrated transport assessment for it. The panel also recommending that if you are doing a development that has some cycle parking or car parking, that parking area should have electrical cable connections or conduit to the edge of that area. It's not recommending that chargers be installed, but it's recognising that the council has policy that it supports electric vehicle charging in developments, and if someone wants to install a charger for their car or their cycle or whatever, that they shouldn't have to dig up the entire development or take out half a wall to get the electrical conduits in. So it's just reducing that cost. Panel had a fair few recommendations specific to cycle parking and facilities because there were a number of requests asking for showers and lockers, which the panel disagreed with. Also, changes to the cycle parking standards to align better with NZTA updated standards. The panel was concerned this was overly prescriptive, that it might increase costs and didn't really account for market demand. And we're also concerned that other submitters hadn't considered those changes when making those submissions. The panel did make recommendations to reduce the number of minimum cycle parks required for, per residential unit from one park per 1 unit to 1 per 4. And also in retirement villages that it would drop down to 1 per 33 units and 1 per 10 units for visitors and 1 per 10 staff. And I should note, because the plan talks about cycling and micro-mobility, that would include mobility scooters, that wouldn't be just bikes. The panel made a change to the table which sets the minimum number of on-site cycling parking spaces. And sorry if you can't see this overly well. That's why I've tried to create some circles here. So how it's written is that the activities are down on the left-hand side, and the standards are for short stay parking are in the middle and long stay parking are on the right. And top left it says any activity in the following zones and talks about the centre zones. And the staff's understanding when this came out is that it was generally read in that row. So any activity in those centre zones would not require short stay visitor parking because the idea is cycle parking could be on the street. But if it's long stay parking, then you would look at the rest of the table. The panel had a different interpretation of this and said that we think that it should be read down the column. So in effect, any activity in those centre zones for all of those activities, commercial, community, educational, residential, etc., that's what these standards apply to, only to those zones and to no others. And so they then recommended a change to the table where that row that we were looking at essentially moves to become a column, and the nil short stay is deleted, and it's clear that for every activity line that it only applies to the centres and mixed-use zones. So that does have some implications. It would mean that cycle parking is only required in the centres and mixed-use zones, and that there'd be no cycle parking in the residential zones. It also means that short-stay cycle parking would now be required in the centre zones, although there is a proviso saying this is only if there's short-stay car parks on site. So previously it said nil. That would be deleted under the panel's changes. I'd just note that this change wasn't made through a submitter request, but it was made because of the way the panel saw or read the table and thought it could be restructured in this way, so based on their own reading. So that's the end of my slides.
Excellent. We'll move to the next, which is renewable electricity generation. So Joe will take us through this.
Thank you. Good afternoon, councillors. My name is Joe Jeffries. I'm a principal planner in the district plan team, and I was the reporting officer for the renewable electricity generation topic. So renewable electricity generation is a standalone chapter in the proposed plan. So that means it's one place where all renewable electricity activities are covered. So it attempts to resolve conflicts with other matters such as landscape and ecology within the chapter itself. You don't need to also look at those chapters. You can look at just this one place for that. The chapter gives effect to the National Policy Statement for Renewable Electricity Generation, so we'll call that the NPS REG for shorthand. And that national policy requires district plans to provide for renewable electricity generation activities. The chapter provides for small-scale, community-scale and large-scale REG activities, which repeats language from the national policy. And there were 15 submitters and 171 submission points on this topic. The key issues identified through submissions and through the hearings on this topic were the extent to which the REG chapter properly gives effect to the national policy statement, whether the chapter appropriately balances the protection of natural, environmental and coastal values with the provision of renewable electricity, and the extent to which the chapter makes appropriate trade-offs and reconciles conflicting national policy direction between the NPS REG, the National Policy for Indigenous Biodiversity, and the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. So those three are all national level policies that sit at the same level. They do somewhat conflict with each other and they don't really talk to each other or resolve that conflict. So the resolution of that conflict takes place within the chapter itself. So the panel recommended a number of changes, and these changes were intended to better give effect to the national policy statement, to provide better guidance, especially around some of those issues where there is conflict with other matters such as landscape and ecology, and to improve the clarity and reduce duplication of provisions. The panel recommended deleting Policy 8, which duplicated some of the other policies, and they recommended the insertion of a new policy to provide guidance on large-scale REG in overlay areas, so in areas where something like landscapes, coastal values or ecology were relevant. They recommended reducing the setback standard for small-scale wind turbines from 60 metres to 15 metres, and they recommended a number of minor amendments for the reasons already mentioned. So that's all I have on that. Thank you.
Sorry, contaminated land and hazardous substances. Who's taking us through this one? Hannah. Brilliant.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Hannah Van Haren, and I'm here to take you through the two chapters of contaminated land and hazardous substances. So first up, contaminated land. The purpose is to provide objective and policy guidance for decision makers implementing the National Environmental Standard for assessing and managing contaminants in soil to protect human health, or otherwise known as the NES-CS, in relation to the identification, management and remediation of contaminated land. There were 12 submissions on this topic, with only one seeking amendment, and the independent hearing panel recommended accepting that submission and adding a mana whenua clause about partnership opportunities for remediation and or site management. On the topic of hazardous substances, so the purpose is to manage the residual risk and cumulative risk of hazardous substances in major hazardous facilities, or MHF. There were 33 submissions and one further submission. The IHP made 3 recommendations, the first being to add a new hazardous facility definition. The second being to add a new a new discretionary activity rule for major hazardous facilities in the port zone, where previously that was a non-complying activity, and they made some minor amendments for clarity as well. That's that for those two chapters. Thank you.
Brilliant. Now we'll move to designations. Jamie, this is that is at the bottom of the Nio Gorge. The former, I think, ferry fuel depot, something like that. Excellent. Jamie.
Kia ora, councillors. Jamie Searle, Senior Planner in the team. Sean's given a very helpful overview of what a designation is and what the process is, so I'll just touch on a couple of the key designations, essentially. So many of the designations that are included in the partly operative plan, the 2024 plan, are designations that were included in the operative 2000 plan, with many of them have minor modifications and corrections to update them. So the panel themselves focused on the effects of those modifications to those designations, the issues raised in submissions, and two new designations. There were 19 requiring authorities in total, and there are 156 designations, I believe, that have been rolled over. 17 designations that were rolled over did not have any modification or submission, so they essentially just get included in the plan as is, no further process. And the two new designations were for two existing schools, St Francis Xavier in Tawa and Sacred Heart Cathedral in Thorndon. So some of those modifications that have come through, I guess, are things like just a slight deletion or slight amendment to conditions of those designations. So in terms of submissions, there were 99 submission points in total across 23 of those designations. And the key issues were really around one of the airport's designations, which is the obstacle limitation surfaces designation, mapping of the KiwiRail designations as it applies to those underground tunnels, and one of Greater Wellington's designations for the Stebbings Valley Flood Detention Dam. So just in general, the airport has 4 designations, one of which is the obstacle limitation services, which is we abbreviate to OLS, and that had significant modifications, which I'll run through in detail over a few slides. While 2 is Miramar South area that's rolled over with some modifications to the conditions. The main airport area is While 4. That wasn't looked at as part of the district plan review process at all, because it had recently been through a process, a separate process, so that's essentially not within scope of this review process, and the same goes for While 5. Partway through the process, While 3 which is the runway extension area, was withdrawn by the airport, and that's essentially merged into While 4. All those extension works had been done and completed. So just to try and explain the OLS, the obstacle limitation services. So the easiest way I find to kind of visualize it is a bowl that essentially sits on the runway of the airport and kind of spans out. And I've got some other figures and diagrams which will help you get a sense of what that is. So what it does do is it controls obstacles such as buildings from penetrating into the safe operating manoeuvring space for aircraft landing and taking off. So it's also when an aircraft is impeded. It applies to both fixed and permanent, permanent and temporary objects, such as cranes as well as buildings. But for the purpose of this, I'll just generically refer to buildings. So this is a simplified diagram of what that looks like in terms of buildings that don't penetrate that surface where approval is not required. And on the right there, you've got a building that does penetrate the surface where approval from the requiring authority, the airport, is required. So that's separate to a resource consent process should a resource consent be needed for something. So this is a diagram from the airport that provides, I guess, the technical detail of the different components of the obstacle limitation surfaces, so the various surfaces. I won't talk to the specifics of each of them at this point, but you've got the runway and the airport in the centre, and then you've got inner surface, and then you've got an outer surface, and different planes and surfaces apply at different heights. So I guess one thing to note is that obstacle limitation surfaces are common in district plans where airports are located. But the big difference from the previous iteration of the OLS is that the surfaces are much closer to ground level, so that requirement for approval kicks in at a much lower level. So this shows the 2000 version on the left, the proposed version on the right. You'll see that they're roughly the same scale, so you'll see one of the biggest changes is what is the outer surface, and that applies to essentially the remainder of the city. So I'll talk to the implications of that in more detail, but the surface is actually much higher than those inner surfaces. So the requirement to seek approval from the airport doesn't apply until you get to a much greater height, as you'd expect. So this is another way to illustrate the OLS. So this is a cross section. It'll be hard to read exactly where those locations are, but the airport is essentially in the middle of the diagram. The green is the existing ground level or terrain, and the purple is the 2000 OLS, and the red line is the updated OLS. So what you can see there is how the green, which is the existing terrain, penetrate in a number of areas based on this cross-section, penetrates the surface already, whereas in the previous iteration it wasn't.
So when we take that cross-section, so if we take that cross-section and then map it out in 2 dimensions across the city, if we go to the next slide, you effectively require permission from the airport to build in the yellow area should you wish to build to more than 8 metres. I will plough on regardless. More than 8 metres. Yes, the increasing to 30 metres in the outer area. The other thing I would point out is if you do look in the central city, although it is coloured green, there are areas there where that surface intersects with the possible upper limits of what we could expect to see built in the future. So this is where things like terrain shadowing become an issue. So terrain shadowing is basically if you have a hill here and a hill here, if you were to build a building in between, you would expect the plane to hit the hill first, so it should be okay to build the building. And so one of the things that is different to this obstacle limitation surface to the previous one is that those exemptions for terrain shielding need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. You want to carry on, Jamie?
Sure.
I assure you, I'm nearly finished.
So helpfully, in partnership with the airport, there's the e-plan itself has a function where you can search an individual site and get information on when, at what height the either notification or approval from the airport is required. So here's an example in Central City where approval wouldn't be required until you hit 46 metres in height. And a table that just gives a couple of few more examples. So in Corey Road, it wouldn't kick in, the approval wouldn't kick in until 30 metres. Woodridge, which is in the approach surface, it would be 8 metres, and that's where it's like these areas are all likely where the existing terrain is already penetrating the surface. Miramar North, again, in the inner horizontal surface, which is kind of the second circle, not the outermost circle, 8 metres, and then an area in the inner horizontal would be 16 metres. So that gives you a sense of what the permitted zone heights are, but when the approval from the airport would be required.
And so what would happen is, should somebody apply for a consent for something that went through that obstacle limitation surface, the airport would be asked for essentially permission to build into that space.
Just to clarify, that would be separate to the consenting process. So the consent could be granted,
yes,
but then approval would be required under a different section of the Act.
Thank you. Sorry. I imagine you have some questions. Oh, damn.
It keeps going. So that gives a pretty good sense of the OLS. We've got a couple of other designations that we'll touch on. Yeah, okay. Are you comfortable if I skip through the other OLS? So onto Kiwi Rail. Relatively straightforward. This one was essentially that all of the corridors or the rail lines were designated in the 2000 plan, but the sections of tunnels were not mapped as part of the designation area. As part of the proposed plan, those areas were included to be mapped, but that led to some uncertainty around how those designations actually impacted the land and the above and those properties and those property rights above the tunnels. So, long story short, the panel directed myself as council officer and Kiwi Rail to find a recommended solution, and that recommended solution is that for the sections of tunnels, the designation, whilst mapped, it's clear in the plan now that the recommendation would make it clear that it only applies to the strata, so the ground, a certain depth under the ground, which is the same as a certain depth above the apex of the tunnel. The other, I guess, key designation to point out in terms of recommended changes is the Greater Wellington Stebbings Valley Flood Detention Dam designation. So it's a large area. The purpose is for flood protection and control purposes. The Greater Wellington advised that the operation of the dam in high rainfall events is necessary to protect numerous landowners and from downstream impacts of flooding. It was identified that the designation area included a number of examples of developed sites or part sites where it didn't seem logical to include as flood areas. The assumption also being that those developments would have obtained or approval from Greater Wellington as part of a consenting process, but potentially also as part of the requiring authority approval process. So the recommendation is essentially that Greater Wellington revised the mapped area to either, as a minimum, to exclude those developed areas so it doesn't apply to those already constructed dwellings. It's difficult to see, but those little bits of red are essentially the areas where development has occurred, and that development is outside the easement areas that are in favour of Greater Wellington that sit on those titles. So those were the proposed locations where where it's recommended that the designation area could be amended. Thank you.
Jen.
You will be shocked to hear that my questions are about YL1. I guess my first one, I've got three. The first one, how often have the existing powers been used by the airport to stop tall buildings under their obstacle limitation surfaces?
So information was, or evidence was presented at the hearing as part of this process to address a similar question, and the evidence was showed that they have approved all requests to date.
My second question is, has there been any analysis of what impact this would have on our ability to have enough, housing development in the city, and or opinion on its the doubt that it would put over development and sort of the certainty of being able to develop taller buildings in Wellington?
The airport presented economic evidence which showed that there was a very minimal impact on realisable capacity, but a potentially greater impact on plan-enabled.
Can you say that in English?
Less on what we would actually expect to be built, but a more significant reduction, I guess, in terms of what is potentially able to be built.
So yes, there was an impact, and we can refer you to the evidence that was presented to quantify that impact.
I'd be very interested in that. And my last question is, and it goes back to the beginning of your presentation, Sean, what powers do we have to ask the airport to reconsider this move? And if they don't, what can we do?
So the power is for council to provide a recommendation to the requiring authority of what should be done in the council's opinion, and that can then be presented to the requiring authority for their consideration. Should that not prove satisfactory to the council, then a appeal process is possible.
Sarah.
Rebecca kind of asked my question, because my question right from the outset was going to be, what's our part in this process, and what decisions are we actually making and when?
So the paper will be coming to you at the beginning of June for decisions. The reason why we have dealt with designations a little bit separately from the rest of the rules is because you as decision makers have a different role to the rest of the plan. So whilst you are adopting, rejecting recommendations on the other chapters of the district plan, with designations your role is much more set in law and much more defined in terms of your ability to contest a designation with the requiring authority.
So we've just heard about how expensive it is to get resource consents. Actually, one of our submitters went through the hourly rate. Was any analysis done? Because from what I can see, this will affect the entire eastern suburbs. There are many houses that would have to have built that are in that envelope already. Has any analysis been done of the cost to our communities of even making changes to their properties when they'll be puncturing this really unrealistic envelope?
Has a transaction cost analysis from the airport been done?
No, but I I believe the actual application process doesn't come at any cost to the landowner aside from, I guess, their time and resources to put together the information that the airport needs. That can differ when it's something significantly over height, where I think the airport looks at maybe requiring specific modelling, but I think that's where we're talking very large buildings or wind turbine type scenario.
Yeah, I think this is done more to protect our heritage than anything that we've had to date. But I also want to ask about sewage, because of course there was a thing said about no sewage treatment within 13 kilometres of an airport because of bird strike. We regularly have overflows at Mott Point. What implications does our current, what guidance do we need to put in there around the current sewage processing to make sure that it doesn't add to the risk of bird strike?
Very good. That would be hazardous substances, wouldn't it?
No, I actually might defer to Jamie. That's obviously probably knows the answer.
So if we're talking about the existing treatment plant, that has a designation that can continue to operate. It would only be if there was a new activity proposed within that area.
What I'm saying is it's not compliant with its consent right now. What implications does that have? It's regularly overflowing. Supposedly a risk of 13 kilometres around an airport.
I think it would be best we provide a written answer for you, just given the number of rules involved.
What I'm saying is, can we come down harder on sewage outflows, so overflows, and this plant not operating as intended?
Well, I think, Sarah, we will provide written feedback. So I'm conscious that the waste team aren't here either to answer what the upgrades might do for overflows over time. So I think we'll do an integrated response back to you on that one.
A risk, or there's not?
Yeah, all the risk is getting less as a result of our investment.
There was a mention of an appeal process if we didn't agree with some of the matter that was recommended to us by the airport. Appeal to whom? MOE?
No, the appeal is to the courts.
Right, okay. Cool. Next question. There was a slide quite early on which mentioned that WCC is not the final decision maker on zoning designations, except in the case of our own recommendations. Have I got that right? Or if I haven't, could you explain it maybe a bit more?
Sorry, those were not zoning recommendations, those were notices of requirement.
Okay.
So council is a requiring authority in and of itself, and so you have a final decision maker role in that. Right. Because effectively it's a bit of a loop.
Yeah, got it, thank you. Last question. How was the IHP able to make a recommendation without regard to a submitter? Because I recall that being a limitation for us, and I had thought that that was also a limitation for them. So
I'll just call Mr. Wharton to the table. But that is one of the reasons why that particular change has been highlighted to you, because that does affect the decision making that you can undertake now. Andrew?
Is this in reference to the table? So the panel and council can make what they see as minor amendments to improve their interpretation of the table, and so the council could take that recommendation and say, actually, we think that the panel is incorrect and that these are substantive changes to the provisions, and so therefore we can just go back to the way the table is initially structured as notified. Because it's not based on a submission, there's less requirements to see what the evidence was by the submitter and what the panel's analysis was at the time, because there was no submission point. So it is a simpler process in terms of evidence and in terms of responding to that recommendation.
Ben, can you hear us? We've noticed your hand is up. If you've got a question.
Yeah, a few questions on the bicycle parking stuff. My first one was, I think you did allude to it in the slide, but the size of a bicycle park, that's an NZTA requirement, if I got that correct?
To clarify, the NZTA doesn't set requirements. They do provide best practice standards, however. And so there is a fairly recent update that accounts for e-bikes and cargo bikes. So, for example, they say a certain percentage of parks should be enabled to or should be wide enough or long enough to fit those types of cycles, and they also account for things like when you're stacking bikes or hanging them. So it's guidance, I guess. We're not required to follow it.
Yeah, but we have followed that best practice guidance in developing the plan?
I used that best practice in response to submissions who said that, so there were a number of submitters who thought that the standards in the plan weren't sufficient, that there was not enough space, there wasn't access, that they didn't account for people wheeling the cycles in, didn't account for security, and so I took a look at the latest standards from NZTA and recommended some changes within the scope of those submissions, accounting for the NZTA guidance, which the panel decided not to go with.
Okay, so now I see that we've reduced the panel's recommendation is from 1 per unit to 0.25 per unit. And I understand that because you had the issue where CBD apartment blocks would require literally a floor just for parking bicycles. But what I'm trying to understand is what's one bicycle park size versus a car park under the recommendations? Like, is it half a car park, half a standard car park is what we're allocating? Because it's an incredible amount of floor space that was being required, was my understanding.
The area of cycle parking is much smaller than a car park requirement. It does vary depending on the design of the building, but it's generally around 1/8 to 1/10 the size. The standards are also relatively flexible. So, for example, the cycle parks can be double stacked if the ceiling height allows for it. So a number of bikes could be hung, so that reduces the area as well. It's more, I think the standards just required a certain number of parks to cater for your e-bikes, which are slightly larger.
Okay. Might go back on the list because I have a few more on this topic.
Sorry, Ben, you may as well just keep going for the sec. We'll try and knock this one off.
Okay, yeah, that'd be good. So I guess, I just want to, because my understanding here, again, was you would literally need to allocate a floor and then some on, say, a 20-storey apartment block. This is under the district plan we passed last year, to comply with the bicycle parking standards. So what's the recommendations we now have in front of us? Are we saying it would be, about a quarter of a floor? Like, do we modelled out what that looks like in terms of floor space requirements?
This was discussed at length at the hearing with the presenters, such as Stride, and I think it becomes slightly more complex because oftentimes the cycle parking ends up in a basement area or in an area of a service location or placed around existing car parking spaces, etc., because they're quite able to be moved into different spaces. But it is clear that requiring cycle parks in a multi-storey building in the city centre would require additional floor space, and that would have a cost. And there was different evidence presented at the hearing as to how much that would cost.
Okay, and just finally, can you just clarify, so where are we mandating that there is a requirement for bicycle parking now under the new recommendations?
So the panel retained the requirement for activities to provide a minimum number of cycle parks. They changed the recommendation for residential activities from obviously from 1 to 0.25, as you pointed out. Through changing the structure of the table, they're also effectively only requiring the minimum cycle parking to the centre zones and mixed-use zones in the city. There are a number of other more minor changes that the panel have recommended, which are in the table, but I didn't want to go through every single one of them.
Gee, sorry, and there was one last one. My understanding that this is something that Bishop's got in his sights as a, like balcony, minimum balconies and things like that as part of RMA reform. Has this been introduced or signalled formally at this stage, or maybe we'll see it in Bill 3?
No, it hasn't been introduced formally by the government. The government has made broader statements about internal amenity and that the planning system should not be accounting for that. As with all government pronouncements, we must work with the laws that are in existence at the time. But if the government did bring in as part of its new planning system, a requirement that internal storage for vehicles and cycles or anything else is excluded, then we would need to adapt our district plan accordingly, in the same way that when the government announced a national direction that minimum car parking requirements were not allowed, we then went and removed them from our district plan.
Cool, thank you very much.
So just staying on the cycle parking, so we've designed our district plan for maximum density in the city centre. Do these moves have a positive or a negative effect on enabling more people to have bike security, bike parking in that density zone?
I may phrase it slightly differently. So the cycle parking provisions were included because there is existing council policy encouraging minimum cycle parking requirements, and so the plan was trying to give effect to that. And the intent of that is to give transport options for people who are living in denser environments, that they have the option to have a secure place to park a scooter or a bicycle and be able to get around. The reason why I lean on that optionality side of things is because, of course, some developers are already providing cycle parks for new apartments and for new office areas, even without us requiring it. So there already is a response to market demand for this.
So they're prioritising optionality over requirement?
That's perhaps that's why it was notified in the plan, and so even with the panel recommendations retaining some minimum cycle parking requirements, that essentially sets a baseline, and any developer that did not provide that would need to go through a resource consent process and say how would they be providing for it, because there may be other reasons. There may be suitable parking elsewhere, there may be sharing parking, they may not need cycle parking for the use of the building. So the decision for the council isn't to whether to have any minimum cycle parking or not. It's whether to adopt the panel's recommendation for reduced numbers of cycle parking minimum requirements.
Okay, thank you. Just back to the OLS, is there some rationale behind the reduction, the metres of, so for example, 16 metres allowance in Mount Vic and 8 metres in Miramar North? I'm just struggling to understand how an airport can ask for people to get consent for that when it's hardly likely that a plane is going to be flying in Austin Street, Mount Vic, or down the Miramar Valley. I mean, it's outrageous.
Jamie?
So the OLS levels are informed by Civil Aviation Authority type regulations and international regulations that start to set where the surfaces need to be. These surfaces, even the modified ones, are, I guess, a compromise, for lack of a better term, in terms of meeting those regulations, strict adherence to those regulations. And this, sorry, I'm just relaying kind of what I learnt through the process. I'm not the expert necessarily in the civil aviation space. And I guess one point that their expert did make through the process is that the relationship between lifting that surface and the implications on like pilot decision making in terms of when they make a decision as to whether they're going to land or not and whether they're going to pull up and circle is not, that relationship is not linear. So if you lift that kind of permitted height by 3 meters, it's not simply that a plane needs to fly 3 meters higher or make a decision 3 meters higher. It's complicated.
Yes.
So when was the last time a plane flew over Austin Street, Mount Victoria?
Unfortunately, we don't spend that much time on flight radar, Your Deputy Worship. We are at a slight disadvantage in answering some of these questions in that we did not draft the notice of requirement for the airport. So we can report to you on the panel's recommendations and where in the evidence we have experienced, but there are some of the more intricate things which are difficult for us to answer.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Just one question. Can I just check in regard to process, when you talked about the actions that we can perform, that the power to provide a recommendation back to the notice of require, whoever they are, and then the appeal process, have we done the first step there yet?
We have not done the first step as yet, and that is because we need the mandate of the council to do so.
Okay, so that's where we're at now.
Yeah, so first we had to tell you what the recommendations were, and now we can begin to move through whichever process councillors decide to take.
Great.
Which will, of course, be outside this briefing where we can't make decisions.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. So just a broad question. What have we actually changed as a result, apart from this previous discussion around the flight paths? It all seems very minor changes, and it cost a lot of money to go through this process.
Yes, but it is the entirety of the district plan. It's fair to say the more exciting bits have more or less been done, but this is all done in your name as governors of the city, so I do have to inform you of it.
Sure. The renewable energy chapter, sorry, can't remember who did that one. Look, ultimately I'm very interested in getting a lot more happening. Will that facilitate a step change? Didn't seem to much. So, and particularly, like, if people want to do their own wind generation, will that be?
There was a change there.
Yeah, I know there was, but step change is what I'm interested in.
I believe it will make it easier for smaller scale renewables. The larger scale were already provided for, but whether that will produce a step change, it's hard to know.
But there's nothing stopping it. So if a provider wants to come along and do some marine energy or another wind farm,
yeah, it is very enabling for renewable electricity, and it is getting our district plan in line with the national policy, which requires the district plan to be enabling of these activities. So it does, provide a more enabling pathway for those activities. Whether that translates into more activity on the ground, it's hard for us to know.
Yeah. In terms of seeing more renewable energy infrastructure actually built, what these changes do is put the city's regulatory systems into a ready state. An actual step change in seeing these things happen will probably come through changes in other systems like financing and technology.
Okay, and just my last set of questions around the designations. You were just waiting for those, weren't you? So from a process point of view, is it possible to just remove some of them when we come to debate in June?
The only designations you would have the power to do that over would be your own ones.
Okay, so if NZTA applied, that is...
No, generally Minister of Crown beats Councillor.
Yeah, unfortunately. And you're still doing some work on the one for mass rapid transit, which would need to be incorporated through a future plan change. Is the progress being made?
Yeah, that would, yes, a corridor protection for mass rapid transit through Adelaide Road would have to be a separate process.
And we can't modify any of the designations? Again, that's the power of the Crown.
You can modify your own designations, but not the ones you're interested in, no.
No, okay, thanks.
Thanks very much. Are these changes, would they be, these recommendations, would they be applied retrospectively?
No.
Okay. So at the moment, when we're talking about things that birds eat, how far away is our tip from the airport at the moment? Is it more than 13 kilometres?
I don't know, I've never measured it.
Yeah.
You could just Google it.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm looking at the food. Pylons, we're talking about pylons. Now, when you look at Wellington, you'll find that the track that the pylons run in, the cables run in, a lot of them are actually very, very close to residential areas now. And so what would be the plan that if those houses wanted to have large additions or something to it, would we actually try and divert them away from the pylons, or would we...
So, if they were directly in the designation pathway, then normally Transpower would have a say over those things. They also have a distance that's applied to the wires, so if you were to build within that distance and start to get too close to the wires, then Transpower would have the power to say no.
Right, great, thanks. The last question was regarding that water storage area in Stebbings Valley. Now, that was just on one of the last slides here. You showed a large area. So what are we currently actually doing there? Like, would that actually inhibit our development of those areas?
So it's Greater Wellington's designation, and what Greater Wellington are doing there is storing floodwater, basically. And so, yes, it would inhibit development in that it's not generally planning practice to live in a place that floods. But that's been built into the system, as it were. So that's part of what's protecting the Tawa stream from runoff from some of those catchments.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. A quick question is, who owns Stebbings Dam? Like, who's responsible for it? Is it us, or is it Regional Council?
So the designation is Greater Wellington's. I'd have to check that all of the land covered by the designation was owned by the Regional Council. We do know that some parts of it aren't. Those are the parts that have been proposed to be removed. But I'm not sure if there's any other. Okay. I have to check the titles.
Thank you. So with respect to the airport, I know they do these things for good reasons, but it's obviously a very contentious point. You know, I'm struggling to see why land that's sideways to the airport is being designated for needing the same level of height control as land that's where the planes could fly, as you know, and has been pointed out. I'm also very conscious that the costs of consenting developments has gone up and up in recent times, and any extra cost is extra cost. So I was wondering, in the interest of trying to get this right, whether it would be possible for the CAA or Wellington Airport, who know more about why this is being done, could perhaps come and take us through their logic of why they've made this significant change with such significant impact.
We can ask the airport to do that. Let's not cross the streams. You'll need to hear from the airport's planning advisors. So we can make that request. I do think it is best that you do hear from them, just because it is their designation. And it is also in their interest that if you are to make a recommendation to them, that it is clear and understandable and practical.
I'll undertake to do that. Tomorrow's briefing is, of course, Hutapara and the Lower Bay Promenade, etc. So, and that is Matt and the GM for operations. So it won't be their expert and their team. So I'll talk to Matt and make sure we get that happening.
I'd be surprised if they could build that. Yeah. I will do that, but perhaps not tomorrow, because it's going to be a very interesting conversation tomorrow. So thank you, Sean. Are we good? I'm just conscious we're closing off at 3. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got. Sorry, I've got a couple more. So going back to the transport levels and the change in the levels, it was like 200 to 500 or 200 to
the assessment thresholds. Yes.
Of what? Is that per hour, per day, movements during the week, trips, cars?
Andrew?
And why is State Highway so much gone lower, you know?
The State Highway threshold is lower because NCTA asked for that and said that the State Highway needs to keep traffic moving, and so they're concerned if there's an activity which is putting significant new car movements onto their state highways, and the panel agreed with that. In terms of the thresholds, that is per day. For heavy vehicles, it's 8 per week, but that is not changed by the panel. So yeah, 500 per day to and from a road. So leaving and coming back would be 2 trips.
Okay. With respect to the bike parks, I also was wondering, the council's district plan removed the need for any setbacks to the side and front of buildings. I was wondering what the interaction is between permitting a building that occupies this entire front of the site and requiring the building to have bicycle parking, and isn't there a conflict there? Or do you say, well, you can't have a setback? You've got to leave some space on the sides to get the bicycle in.
The plan did say that the cycle parks can be within buildings. They can be within sheds, garages. You can take them through houses to the backyard. The one thing was it could not be part of the residential unit, and say that's where you're storing your bike. That was the one rule.
Okay. And one last thing, in terms of the requirement to have power on these parking areas, that's a cost, isn't it? That's an increased cost to a developer who may not want to do that. And so, what sort of cost are you talking about? Because we do know we experience very large costs when we're putting in power for like traffic lights. Tens of thousands of dollars. So you are talking that sort of money, aren't you, to development that's power-enabled parking?
So, just to clarify, Andrew. Does the recommendation require electricity to be provided to the car park, or just the ducting to allow it to take place? There's quite a big, as you can appreciate, quite a big difference between enabling it with electricity and simply providing a duct to go in.
Yeah, no, sometimes I think we should do that with our roads, given the cost we pay for getting our own power traffic lights.
It does seem like good planning, doesn't it? Yeah.
It is must be electric charging ready by being serviced with an electrical cable conduit from the electricity supply to the parking space or the collective parking facility. And this is where the parking spaces are required to be provided. So it's likely to be a relatively significant development in any case that will include some form of electrical cabling. So it's making sure that that cabling is connected to the parking area.
Okay, so you would have to put in the conduit and the cable through the conduit.
Correct. But you would not need to provide the actual charging units for each park.
Yeah, obviously not. Okay, thank you.
Just getting back to the airport designation, did we provide any evidence, through council officers or a report or something on some of the aspects that might concern us, such as cost and consistency with our overall spatial plan? Just seeking to understand the process of what's actually happened to this point.
Essentially, the answer is no. A Section 42A recommendation report was prepared to inform the panel, so that's more of an independent report as opposed to necessarily on behalf of council as a submitter.
Were we entitled to submit to this process or to put forward an officer report?
So council did make a submission on some aspects of the OLS, one of which was for the height allowance to align with the medium density residential permitted height of 11, so move it from an 8 metre, where approval's needed, essentially, that it's triggered at 11 metres, not 8 metres, and a few other smaller changes to the wordings.
And were they taken on board?
The panel did not recommend changing those specifically, no.
Okay. Well, I can't see how this is going to be consistent with the upzoning in Kilburnie, for example. Absolutely going to kill it.
I know, such many questions. Can you provide, I noticed you gave some examples, and I'm interested in the flight path, but in particular, what it looks like over Newlands, Johnsonville, Broadmeadows, Kandala, because that's been the subject of a number of concerns. And the examples that you've given as well, I wonder whether you could overlay a key on each of those slides, because I couldn't see a key of what each line meant. I know you talked it through, but...
Yes. So yes, we can put a key on and we can provide a larger graphic. Now, the obstacle limitation surface is different to the flight paths. So the flight paths take place above the obstacle limitation surface. So what this is doing is basically providing the landscape control, and then the flight path is then designated, is then determined over top of it. I have been working on a way of showing these things three-dimensionally. The difficulty has been to do so in an intelligible way. And this is something the airport has also experienced some challenges with. Most planners do have these challenges. Once you get to the size of a city, these controls are quite hard to actually visualise. So yes, we can provide larger versions of those documents with the keys so that they're legible. And then the challenge becomes to explain the difference between the OLS and the flight paths.
Right, that would be useful if we could have that. And also, in terms of the flight paths, I know in terms, and I think it was one of those slides where you talked about the sort of the zones, and we've got the Miramar zone and a couple of others, of how our flight paths are articulated in our district plan, because obviously there are some concerns about the change in the flight path in recent years and the impact on residents. And I'm just trying to see how that is referenced or reflected in the district plan.
So the flight path changes that have been made by the airport are not in the district plan. That has been done under, I think, CAA regulation. So that's outside the jurisdiction of the RMA. What the RMA's regulations are doing through the district plan are controlling the effect of buildings going up into the flight path. So it's not controlling the planes, it's controlling the buildings.
So it doesn't control noise levels? The district plan has nothing about noise levels?
Not in respect of planes once they get above a certain height off the ground.
Okay, so how do you determine what level of ground that is? Is that set by civil aviation, or is that determined by our own district plan?
That's actually a matter that we're mediating with the airport on at the moment following the Tranche 1 decision. So the RMA can regulate noise effects with regards to air noise, and that is something that's under appeal that we're working through with the airport currently.
So when you say under appeal, can you explain what you mean by that? I mean, appealing what? Yeah.
So they weren't happy with the noise rules that the council determined last year, and so we're working with them through a mediation process through the courts currently. I can't go into detail on it because that is subject to appeal, and I can't go into specifics around that, but it is a live matter that the team is working through with the airport right now.
And so we don't have any say in that as the governors?
The council has authorised officers to engage through the mediation process. So you passed resolutions with regards to that in August last year, and we've been exercising the resolutions that you passed at that time.
Right. I won't drag this out, but I would like to just find out a little bit more.